This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is The Extended Universe, How Disney Killed the Movies and Took Over the World by Vicky Osterweil. In her provocative history of Disney's rise to cultural dominance, Vicky Osterweil takes us on a quest to discover how Disney's Imagineers have made it impossible to reflect on the wonders of growing up without thinking of Disney movies, amusement parks, and merchandising. As Natasha Leonard puts it, Osterweil offers a masterful expose of and intervention against one of the most insidious and powerful property regimes of the last century: intellectual property. Osterweil is the brilliant, generous, and revolutionary guide we need to rethink cultural production today and kill the mouse inside our heads. Find The Extended Universe at haymarketbooks.org, where all hardcover books are 10% off every day. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is the 8th episode of Nusantara, a series on the history of Indonesia. Nusantara is a word that refers to the vast geographic archipelago that only through centuries of colonial capitalism and the struggles against it became a nation, one whose boundaries, identities, and purpose remain contested to this day. This is the final episode of the series. We start by discussing the ongoing conflicts over the role of Islam in post-New Order society. There's a lot to discuss here. Since the final years of the New Order, middle-class Indonesians have increasingly taken on the hijab and public demonstrations of piety. Fundamentalist groups have engaged in terrorist attacks on civilians and persecuted religious minorities. And, more generally, the annihilation of the left has led social grievances to increasingly be expressed in the language of Islam. And yet the proportion of Indonesia voting for Muslim parties remains where it's always been, about a third. The Islamist dream of making Indonesia an Islamic state remains a fantasy. But fundamentalists can still powerfully shape Indonesia's politics, as was made clear in Jokowi's first few years in office. In 2014, SBY's reactionary presidency was followed by the election of Joko Widodo as president. The Jakarta governor, known as Jokowi, was widely celebrated as an ordinary man, independent from oligarchic political cartels, who would push forward reformasi, pluralism, and even, perhaps, justice and accountability for human rights atrocities, including the repressed, denied, obfuscated, mass anti-communist murders of 1965 and 66. Quickly, however, Jokowi came to the conclusion that he couldn't beat those entrenched forces, and so he decided to join and then dominate them. In 2016, Jokowi faced the eruption of Islamic street protests. The so-called 212 movement held mass demonstrations in downtown Jakarta demanding the persecution of Jokowi's ally, Jakarta Governor Basuki Cahayapurnama, known as Ahok, who was falsely accused of blasphemy against Islam. In response, Jokowi sold Ahok out. He was prosecuted and imprisoned. Meanwhile, Jokowi embraced the police, going so far as establishing something like a dual function for the force. The same sort of dual function model, or dwifungsi, that Suharto had established for the military. Jokowi then used that empowered police force to repress his political opponents, including the Islamic activists who had led the charge against Ahok. After his 2019 re-election, Jokowi appointed current President Prabowo Subianto to serve as his defense minister. Prabowo is nearly everything repugnant about the New Order regime wrapped into one person. Prabowo served as a special forces general and was implicated in atrocities committed by the military in East Timor and West Papua, as well as against pro-democracy student activists in 1998. He was married to Suharto's daughter and is the son of leading New Order technocrat and economist Sumitro Jojo Hadikusumo. In 2024, Jokowi helped orchestrate Prabowo's election as his successor. Prabowo ran with Jokowi's son Gibran as his running mate. This move was only allowed thanks to a legal loophole established by a highly criticized constitutional court decision that allowed Gibran to run even though he was too young according to the law. One of the constitutional court justices was Jokowi's brother-in-law. Since assuming office in 2024, Prabowo has been consumed by scandals and met by large protests. Perhaps, as these contradictions of post-New Order Indonesia heighten, we're beginning to witness the outlines of a new left that can contend for power. Indonesia lives with the legacy of the New Order regime and the genocidal destruction of the Indonesian left upon which it was founded. The organized communist left was annihilated. A corporatist oligarchic regime was installed. Systematic propaganda defined the ideological landscape. The extractivist plunder of Indonesia's vast natural resources became the source of a few people's wealth at the expense of real development. Indonesia remains a giant but very poor country on the periphery of the world system run by a very small number of very rich people. A country that once led the colonized world in revolution maintains its own settler colonial occupation of West Papua. Once upon a time, Indonesia led the way in imagining that a different world for oppressed people everywhere was possible, and that organized masses had to seize that future and make it. Nusantara, our 8-part series on the history of Indonesia, we set out to explain how this all came to be, and to play our small part in giving you some analytical tools required to change things wherever you live. Useful context, whether you're listening from New York or Jakarta. 2 final notes. First, Indo-Progress is Indonesia's leading left-wing publication, a publication that my guests have played a big role in. The Dig is collaborating with Indo-Progress on a publicity campaign for Nusantara in Bahasa Indonesia to spread the word about this series across that vast archipelago. I'll link to Indo-Progress's Instagram in the show notes to give you a sense of what they're up to, specifically what they're up to spreading the word about Nusantara. It's pretty great. And second, if you want to learn more about Indonesia's colonization and exploitation of West Papua, check out the documentary Pig Feast, Colonialism in Our Time. Really worth watching. Okay, if you found this series interesting and helpful in understanding Indonesia, a huge part of the world that maybe you didn't know anything about, and if you appreciate the work we do here at The Dig to help people understand the world, all of the world, in order to change it, please make a monthly or annual contribution at patreon.com/thedig. The reason your contribution matters so much is that's how we pay for everything we do to put everything out on the pod without paywalling a single episode of the pod. As you know, this is a political education project from the US, but with and for the global left. Please do your part in making sure we can keep doing it. Plus, we have loads of really excellent swag. That's patreon.com/thedig. Okay, here's Rianne Subijanto, Supriatma, Iqra Anugrah, and back to join us for the last question, Farabi Fakih, for episode 8 of Nusantara, the final episode in our series on the history of Indonesia. Rianne Subijanto is a professor of communication studies at Baruch College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's the author of Communication Against Capital, Red Enlightenment at the Dawn of Indonesia, and a co-editor of The Indonesian Left in the 20th Century, Beyond the Rise and Fall of a Party. Mada Supriatma is a visiting research fellow at the Isaias Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. He specializes in Indonesian politics, civil-military relations, ethnic conflict, and state bureaucracy. Iqra Anugrah is a research fellow at the Department of Foreign Languages, Literatures, and Modern Cultures at the University of Turin. He also holds affiliate positions at the International Institute for Asian Studies at Leiden University and the Institute for Economic and Social Research, Education, and Information in Jakarta. An interdisciplinary political theorist, his current project investigates multi-strand conservatism in modern Indonesia. He maintains an active engagement in Indonesia's popular social movement scene. Farabi Fakih is the head of the master's program in the history department of Gadjah Mada University in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. He's worked on the history of the decolonization of the Indonesian state and is currently working on a manuscript on the history of natural resource management, particularly oil and gas. Islam has continued to play a major conflictual role in Indonesian politics and society since the end of New Order. And you all have referred to this a few times so far in this interview, but some signal events. There was sectarian violence that broke out in the Moluccas, where an Islamist militia called Laskar Jihad waged anti-Christian attacks across the region with support from the Indonesian military. Then there was Jemaah Islamiyah, which orchestrated the globally known 2002 mass bombing in Bali, which killed roughly 200 people, majority foreign tourists, around a nightclub. In 2016, Basuki Cahaya Purnama, the Christian Chinese former governor of Jakarta, a close ally of Jokowi, who we'll talk about a bunch in a minute, this former governor of Jakarta, known as Ahok, he was falsely charged with blasphemy against Islam and imprisoned under pressure from a massive far-right Islamist movement. So obviously, this cuts through the entire series. The role of Islam in society has divided Indonesians since the revolution. How has it shaped the 2.5 decades since the fall of New Order? Did New Order, in massacring the communists, did it intensify the Islamicization of Javanese society, including by substantially reducing the long-time Abangan presence?
Yeah. After 65, after the massacre of the communists, I think the main target of the New Order was to emasculate the Islamist factions in the society. And as you know, just like in the election in 1955, the Islamic powers is only around a third of Indonesian political power electorally. So it is quite big because the nationalists and the communists take over more than 60%, and then the Islamic parties got more or less 30%. After the New Order, I think it stayed the same. So what the New Order did was just to try to incorporate all of the radical elements, but at the same time to control them, to create, I think they orchestrated tensions also between the radical and the moderates. So the moderates just get scared of the radicals, and then they can control it in form of a very, very tame political party. There's a hope after the fall of Suharto. That's one of our Islamic movement, because during the New Order, the radical factions going underground. And then after the New Order, they resurfaced in the form of the Islamist party, Partai Keadilan, that was the Justice Party. Now it's become the Welfare Justice Party, Partai Keadilan Sejahtera. But when you look at all of the electoral results, of the Islamic parties, all the Islamic party. NU has PKB, Parti Kebangkitan Bangsa, the Awakening, the Nation Awakening Party, and then Muhammadiyah more or less went to PKS, but also Muhammadiyah. I think they try to play it smart by putting their activists everywhere. Also NU, but NU is more specific because they have their own political party. So overall, I think it's still 1/3 of the electorate going, I think, a vote for the Islamic parties. So what's happened just right after the New Order? The radicalism, the violence, the Laskar Jihad, the Majelis Mujahideen, which affiliated with Al Qaeda. I think there's some frustration among some small section of the Islamic community that they know that they cannot become a majority in no way that they will be able to govern Indonesia. So that's why then I think they tried to radicalize the society, but they failed miserably because of the response of I think the majority of Indonesians, which remains very moderate and very pragmatic. So you see all of the radical ideas, I think, has become the biggest legacy of the New Order was this to moderating everything. Yeah, there's no except probably the military, which is still very, very radical in its own and its power and its ambition and its networks of power. So Islam is still influential, but just like the people on the left, they are not inspiring anything to the society. What they are not offering any alternatives for what's going on for the future. Of course, they have an imagination of Ummah, for example. Of course, they have an imagination of a Sharia law and society will be regulated by the Islamic principles. But it fails. And I think right now, Indonesia is in crisis right now, and it's very, very interesting to watch that there's no answer from the Islamic factions. Also, no answer from the left, no answer for this crisis, and no clear answer from the Islamic faction. So what's going on? We don't know. We don't know. We are stuck in the middle.
An interregnum.
Yeah.
Yeah, I second what Made said about the transformation of Islamic and Islamist politics more specifically. This is something that Fedi Hadis wrote in his book, Islamic Populism in Indonesia and the Middle East. Indeed, in the absence, right, in the aftermath of the destruction of the left, of the communists, Islam became a channel, a voice through which the masses could voice out their aspirations. So one of the examples that Fedi Hadis gave is Solo, right? This city in central Java, which used to be a stronghold of the PKI, of the communists. Over time, it turned to become a stronghold for Islamists, right? So we saw this transformation. And at one point, these various expressions of Islamic politics, especially the Justice Party, which later turned into the Prosperous Justice Party or Welfare Justice Party, as Madi said, it faced an impasse because it did not have access to big capital in the Indonesian context, which in this case dominated by the ethnic Chinese. This differentiated them with, for example, the AK Party, right, the AKP in Turkey, which were able to gain support from the interior bourgeoisie, the export-oriented bourgeoisie, that became part of their support base. Now, indeed, there are a number of problems with political Islam more broadly. Obviously, some turn to violent radicalism. Others, as Made said, have not been able to offer an alternative vision against the oligarchization of Indonesian politics. Many including those in mainline Islamic organizations, right? These religious elites, right, in organizations like Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama, they've been also co-opted by oligarchic interests, by these old elites with ties to the new order and capital, for sure. So there is indeed a vacuum, right, for a progressive Islamic articulations, let's say. There are groups who've been championing a more progressive interpretation of Islam and also working at grassroots level, but these groups remain small in number. In early 2000, in response to all this Islamist violence by fundamentalist groups, there was a collective of liberal Muslim intellectuals called Liberal Islam Network, Jaringan Islam Liberal. This also became co-opted by the many oligarchic elites that I mentioned. And sadly, some of them become full-blown reactionaries, basically, making the arguments for justifying the expansion of mining industries, for example, or even in some cases supporting Israel's war in Gaza. So that just tells you the state of Islamic politics in Indonesia today.
I just wanted to add that I think something that has not been mentioned so far is that political Islam gained ground in Indonesia, especially during SBY's presidency in 2004 to 2014. He did not create Islamist power, but he often accommodated conservative Islamic actors. Under SBY, the institutionalization of Islam intensified, and the state often favored Islam publicly as political backup. So, for example, he empowered MUI, which is the Indonesian Ulama Council, to draft controversial fatwas, labeling liberal, plural, and secular ideas as haram, for example. He also banned Ahmadiyah from proselytizing and practicing their faith freely. He also expanded the Sharia law in Aceh. He institutionalized the halal or Islamic economy like Sharia banking law in 2008. So his presidency was key in creating this infrastructure of political Islam. And this infrastructure helped make religious minorities more vulnerable. I think I mentioned before that the Ahmadis, especially Shia, Christian people, minorities, they face pressure and violence. And you mentioned the case of Ahok. The case of Ahok also showed how far Islamic mobilization could go. Because in his case, a blasphemy accusation, it became a mass political weapon. It's crazy to watch, people, demonstrating en masse on the street on the basis of blasphemy. And it worked. Ahok was arrested and went to jail, right, for a couple of years. But here is also something that we need to highlight, that Islamism did not actually simply take over the state. Islamic populism remains fragmented. Economic frustrations, political dissatisfaction, and social anxieties are all often expressed through religious language rather than class politics. As Made has mentioned, left politics has been destroyed at this point, so religious language is used for grievances. So this has strengthened moral conservatism and religious majoritarianism. But at the same time, it has not brought Indonesia any closer to becoming an Islamic state. So that remains an aspiration of only a relatively small minority. So in other words, Islam has become a powerful language of political mobilization, but not necessarily a vehicle for transforming the Indonesian state itself. Also, Islamism is often used by secular or oligarchic elites during elections. And we watch this all the time, even with Prabowo's presidency, like his election. But later on, they are contained after they're being used. So Islamist movement become powerful, not simply because society become more religious. Actually, the religiosity, in my view, is in the appearance only, but because their agendas align with the interests of political elites, this is why they become powerful. So when elites find these movements useful, religious ideas become institutionalized and gain access to state power. But when they no longer serve elite interests, they often lose momentum and are marginalized.
that blasphemy case obviously reflects these questions over the role of Islam in society, but also leads me to ask about the position of Chinese Indonesians in post-New Order Indonesia. I mean, this is another thread that we've been unraveling since the early years of Dutch colonialism. Where did New Order, which raised up this kind of peculiar oligarchic class of Chinese Indonesians who were politically powerless but economically dominant, where has that left the position of Chinese Indonesians in Indonesia post-New Order?
I think it's a huge difference compared to the Chinese Indonesian during the New Order, during the colonial time, and then being used during the New Order and after in the post-New Order. Take for example, I just was fascinated by the facts when going to the traditional markets everywhere in Indonesia. In the 90s, when I go to the traditional market, I always big store always owned by Chinese. But now, after the riots in 98 in Jakarta, it's just all pribumi. Where's the Chinese gone? Yeah, where's all of the generation of the Chinese? Because this is almost a generations. Where are they going? They are not in the public space anymore. Yeah. So a lot of Chinese, I think right now, because of the online business, because of the bank, they become the white collar workers, and they know that they have to survive by not living together like before, living in one complex, all dominated by Chinese. It's still like that, but it's changed quite a lot. Yeah, the Chinese went to the apartment right now, so it's become try to not appear as a Chinese, but at the same time they also get their rights. This is for the ordinary Chinese, right? Because all of the Chinese schools are back. Mandarin were taught in schools, private schools, everywhere. You can easily learn Mandarins right now. Even the indigenous ones, ordinary Indonesian, non-Chinese Indonesians could learn Mandarin right now. So because of the economy. And then I think this is a very important, but also Ahok also brings a twist because according to Ahok, and I think according to people who watch the case closely, it is Jokowi who put Ahok actually in jail because he has to alleviate the cost of being in confrontation with Muslim, with Islam. That's what according to his lawyer Ahok himself, and because he has to go to jail. He's become politically toxic. He become liability for Jokowi, so he has to go in order to calm down or all of this very radical Muslim. But at the same time, then Jokowi crushed this movement, especially the populist movement led by FPI, Front Pembela Islam, Islamic Defender Front, led by Habib Rizik in Jakarta. It is a serious challenge. This organization and Habib Rizik became a serious challengers to Jokowi regime at that time. And then by putting Ahok in jail, and then he calmed down all the people who sympathized with the FBI, and then at the same time he crushed this organization, the FBI. Right now, also the Chinese quite understood that this what the trend of the society. When Jokowi came to power, they see the hopes, and Jokowi is a very very strict guy, and he knows how to play. He knows how to play the electoral politics very, very well. So his tactics was he divided the Muslim electorate into two, using every means. In the social media, he actually divided and break the Islamic electorate, 50% and 50%. But at the same time, he tried to sow fear, sow hatred toward the majority within the minority. So then, if you look at the exit poll, Jokowi in 2014, Jokowi became the main antithesis of SBY because, as Ada has mentioned, SBY was a political affiliation in nationalist and religious. So he accommodated all the Islamic radicals into his government, ideas and programs, and etc. But Jokowi, I think, is more like his selling point is liberal pluralist. This is a pluralist in its naked form as a political tool. So then he got more than 90% of the vote from the minorities. If you look at the exit poll 2014 and 2019, you look at the Christians, for example. So more than 90%. The Chinese, they're scared of the Muslim. This is card. The Muslim card is a very, very potent and powerful card that played by Jokowi. But I think right now Prabowo doesn't have that. So doesn't have the card to play, and he played the military card. So this is a little bit different. As for the Chinese, I think they are really appreciate of Jokowi. They really appreciate of Gus Dur. They really appreciate of Jokowi because they feel that they are being protected under Jokowi. So you have to remember also, Jokowi created a small party, Indonesian Solidarity Party. It's not Jokowi who established it, but one of his followers, I think, and also finance these parties. And then I think it is very interesting political party because the first chairwoman was a Chinese, a woman, and a Chinese, and a Christian. Yeah, it didn't pass a threshold, so it didn't any representative in the Indonesian parliament. But it's right now, Jokowi is using took over this political party, put his son as the chairman of the political party, and now PSI is identical with Jokowi. But I think if you look at the PSI, the first time this political party ran in the election in 2019, I was in Sumatra and also all over Java at the time doing research, and I noticed that almost all of the officials or the party activists are Chinese. It's actually become the Chinese political party. That was before to 2019, but now I think it changed a lot because of Jokowi. More people from, I think, non-Chinese Indonesians.
I just want to add that I think it's really important when we talk about Chinese Indonesian in the recent past about what happened in May 1998, the riots. It left a deep trauma for the communities. Chinese businesses and homes were targeted. They were burned down. The women suffered sexual violence. And this violence just showed how much ethnic scapegoating remained politically available, right, during these kind of moments of crisis. So the Ahok case actually showed both progress and limits. It would be unimaginable to have a Chinese Christian to be a governor in Indonesian New Order era. So it's amazing to have Ahok to be a governor of Jakarta. That showed us progress. But also the 2016-17 anti-Ahok mobilization also showed us how that ethnic scapegoating continued to be politically viable. This anti-Chinese rhetoric, alongside accusations of blasphemy. What I want to say also is that today, Blimade has described that really well, but I just want to say that younger generations today often experience identity very differently. Right, the Chinese cultural expression increasingly become normalized, especially if you go to TikTok or Instagram. There is this term called Cindo or Cina Indonesia. which is a very is considered a neutral term. They adopted this. They identify strongly as both Indonesian and Chinese.
We've been referencing this important moment in recent Indonesian history frequently over the last few questions, which is the election of Joko Widodo, known as Jokowi, in 2014. And at the time it sparked these enormous hopes that, at least from the US perspective, felt very Obama-esque, that there was going to be this deepening of reformasi, even hopes for some sort of real acknowledgement, even reparations for the mass murders of 1965 and 66. And Jokowi, for people who haven't followed him, he's often been portrayed as an everyman who rose from humble origins, someone who stood apart from the oligarchic clans and party cartels who've traditionally run Indonesia. But his era ended in a massively disappointing manner when he played a key role in bringing the current president, Prabowo Subianto, to power, with Jokowi's son as the vice president, and even, as you mentioned earlier, Made, allegedly orchestrating the persecution of his one-time ally, Ahok. How did Jokowi rise to Jakarta governor and then the presidency and develop the sort of image and reputation that he did? Why did his election generate such high expectations, and why has it ultimately played out in the way that it has? How should we understand Jokowi?
So Jokowi came from a furniture business background in Solo. He's not from the military. He's not from the new order bureaucracy or a major political dynasty. He actually, then he started as a mayor of Solo before he became a governor. Yeah, he developed a reputation for modesty, wearing just white cloth, white shirt, direct engagement, and practical problem solving. That's his reputation. He also has a reputation of blusukan. It means impromptu visits to neighborhoods and markets. And that became his political trademark that he used later as a governor and also as a president. And his rise coincided with widespread frustration with post-reformasi politics. By late 2000s, many Indonesians had become disillusioned with corruption, party cartels, and oligarchic politics. And Jokowi appeared to offer something entirely different. This is a technocratic, clean, and ordinary politician, right? And his governorship of Jakarta transformed him into a national figure, especially his partnership with Ahok. It projected this image of competence and reform. So the 2014 election generated enormous hope. Iqra and I actually wrote a lot, right? Iqra in Indo Progress, several articles, separately and also together. Us as Indo Progress, we give our critical support of Jokowi. And I just want to say here, a lot of people actually condemn Indo Progress later on for giving this critical support. But what I want to say is that we have to see everything historically. At the time, we didn't know that Jokowi would turn to the right. But at the time, he represented this break, from what we had before. And so at the time, we saw reformasi activists, for example, we saw him as a democratic reformer, and then human rights group, they hope for accountability for 1965. So we really saw him as a break from the new order and post-reformasi oligarchy. Now his victory over Prabowo, it was symbolically important, right? Because Prabowo, and I actually wrote an article here about this specifically. Prabowo represented the military and new order path, while Jokowi represented civilian politics and democratic reform, at least in their rhetoric and their platform, right? The slogans, etc. So the election was often framed as a choice between reformasi versus authoritarian restoration. When Jokowi entered office, he faced significant constraints. He did not control PDIP. He lacked a strong parliamentary coalition. He himself did not possess his own party machine. And don't forget, the oligarchic structures, regardless, they remain intact. regardless who won, right? And so 65 and human rights, Jokowi largely retreated. There is no prosecution. There is not really truth commission emerge, even though we were so hopeful in 2014 this would happen, change the course of 65. Then, because he got blocked, in terms of human rights, etc., Jokowi actually turned toward development and infrastructure. So he focused so much on building roads, ports, railways, industrialization. He has this very ambitious project of moving the capital from Jakarta, that's sinking, to Borneo. He also moved closer to the old elites, right? So formal generals entered his cabinet. Prabowo, he himself became defense minister after 2019 election. There's a lot of coalition building, right? So Jokowi, and this is Mitzner, he argues that Jokowi gradually became an establishment politician because he relied heavily on the oligarchic alliances. And then political competition became narrowed, right? And the final disappointment, and this is why I think Blimado has nothing else than critics, is that in 2024, Jokowi supported Prabowo's presidential bid. His son, Gibran, he became Prabowo's vice presidential running mate, following a very controversial constitutional court decision. And so many of the former supporters, they all viewed this as a betrayal of reformasi and anti-new order politics. So where is he now? He evolved from an outsider to an incumbent. And his presidency basically symbolizes what many scholars today call the democratic decline.
Yeah, I agree with Anna on that point. Back then, I think for many folks in mainstream civil society, as well as the more contentious, progressive, even leftist social movement circles, Jokowi was seen as a hope, or at the very least, a better alternative compared to Prabowo, which, as Anna mentioned, represented the authoritarian past, the atrocities, the corruption, and obviously the connection with the New Order regime, right? And indeed, yeah, we both wrote articles about this. And to be fair, it was not only in the progress, but as I mentioned, a broad range of civil society and social movement actors decided that indeed it was better to put our bet on this new guy who represented a break from the past, who is a civilian. But very quickly, indeed, I think a year or maybe 1.5 years after he was appointed as president, after he took power, things quickly turned sour, really. So he realized that, he couldn't push the reforms that he wanted to push. And from the standpoint of understanding Jokowi's agency as a political actor, he decided that it's better to play the typical oligarchy game, right? So that's why he started establishing and gaining support from the police force, for example, and other elements of the oligarchic elites and whatnot. So that indeed became the source of disappointment for many in social movements, in civil society circles. I should also mention that I think starting from 2015 onwards, there have been growing splits and rifts within social movements, among activists, and sometimes even among the mass base. Obviously, we had the 2016 Islamist mobilization that was quite a new development at that time, and the social movement folks were not ready to respond to that. But even before that, activists, community organizers, unions, popular organizations, they were already split, in whether or not they should continue supporting Jokowi, essentially. Some activists continued to serve in Jokowi's administration. That also created a lot of tensions and controversies. So this also represented, different viewpoints, different strategies and tactics, right, in intervening the capitalist state of Indonesia through the figure of Jokowi. And I think in many ways it reveals the potentials and indeed limits of this kind of politics. I think the three of us here, Made, Ane, and I, we obviously are among the first to criticize Jokowi. I think early on, despite the many complaints people threw at the Progress at the time, but we were we pretty quickly criticized him.
Yeah.
And this continued until today. Right? I don't think Indonesian social movements recover from that trauma, let's say, and this quote unquote betrayal of by Jokowi, vis-a-vis his civil society supporters, obviously was demonstrated in the leads up to the 29 elections, right? With the with the emergence of the anti-oligarchic, anti-elite reform is corrupted movement,
Yes.
where when you had perhaps one of, if not the biggest student demonstrations criticizing all sorts of government policies under Jokowi's administration, and that, as I mentioned, that was one of the biggest student protests, also joined by other popular forces after Reformasi. So that just shows you the extent to which this hope, gradually and fundamentally turned into a big, massive disappointment for social movement folks.
I think, as I mentioned before, is Jokowi was antithesis of SBY, and his opponent at that time in 2014 was Prabowo Subianto, has a similar politics to SBY, and also aligned himself with the Islamic forces. Islamic forces is still very, very important in 2014. But then Jokowi, I think, has developed a reputation as a pluralist, as a liberal. So he attracted a lot of liberal activists to support him. I still remember that his rise actually helped by Tempo, the liberal magazines, who who put him as a person of the year or something like that. So the most capable mayor in Indonesia. So that's his start. It's become bigger and bigger. It's become more popular. When he ran into Jakarta governor, he seek help from so many oligarchs. One of them was Hashim Joyohadikusumo. Hashim himself later on told in so many interviews that he gave money to Jokowi. And then after that, in 2014, I think, despite all of the leftists and liberals and activists, we are together supporting Jokowi just because he's not Prabowo. I think I was very cautious at that time. Running in the Progress, I never wrote, I still remember this, I never wrote about Jokowi, not a single piece. Always about Prabowo, everything about Prabowo. He's a political advisor, Rob Allen, the Republican pollster from the United States, for example, stuff like that, but never about Jokowi. But I think the biggest challenge for Jokowi came on December 12, 2016. This is the biggest social movement in order to show force to Jokowi. This is the biggest social movement in Indonesia, in Indonesian history. I was in downtown Jakarta at that time. It's known as 212 movement. 2 December 2016, right? 2 December, right? Yeah, 2 December 2016. I was in Jakarta. I saw it firsthand how big it is, a very, very big masses. And then at that time, I feel that this is the end of Jokowi. But it's not. This guy has a gut. He is very, very brave. he went out from his palace and then talked to the protesters. I think almost people claim that it's almost 1 million of them. I believe that because it's huge, and I think it's just very nicely coordinated. With that kind of masses, very controllable, very organized, and even after the protest, there's no litter, no waste. They're all put in the garbage. They clean up the city right away. So then I just said, well, this is starting from that time. I think Jokowi learned that he needs to go back to the old forces. So he took Wiranto, put it in his cabinet, and then at that time he's starting to what's that? I think the first move that he did was that he knows that he didn't have ally within the Indonesian military. So what he did was that he embraced the Indonesian police, make this an alternative as the competitor of the military. So since then, Indonesian police become a source of power. I think the biggest source of power for Jokowi. He used it in so many things. I think this is very, very typical Jokowi. He let people corrupt, and then after that, he built a case. If he cannot control this person, very influential person, he will build a case using the military and the state prosecutor. This kind of tactics make him stay in power. And he empowered a police. I think around that time, around 2018, I wrote an article in East Asia Forum about the dual function of the police. So police for Jokowi is like the military for Suharto. That the thesis, I think. And I think learning from this, he established himself. I think I agree with Anna and Iqra. He established himself as the one of the oligarch, one of the main player in Indonesian politics, even until now. You see, just last week, Indonesia, the student who went to Gibran, Jokowi's sons, paid by the police. There's still. Jokowi is still using the police as political tools against his opponents. So that's why Prabowo right now has to deal with this kind of thing, because the police still loyal to, I think some of the police still loyal to Jokowi.
President Prabowo Subianto, whose election we've been circling around for a few questions now, was the son-in-law of Suharto. I say was because I think he is no longer married to Suharto's daughter, and the son of a very important New Order technocrat named Sumitro Joyo Hadikusumo. And he's also a Fort Benning trained Special Forces general who oversaw brutal, murderous counterinsurgencies in East Timor and West Papua in the 80s and 90s, and who helped start violent riots around Suharto's fall in 1998. Who is Prabowo? How did he come to power? And what does it mean that he did? Does this represent essentially a kind of perverse reversion to New Order?
Yeah, I think so. Prabowo is a guy who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He's a very lucky. he was born from one of the player in Indonesian politics, Sumitro Jaya Hadikusumo. His granddad was a banker. Yeah, he was very, very rich since the very beginning. And then Sumitro joined the PRRI rebellion and has to go to exile, where Prabowo spent most of his childhood. But I think after that, he came back to Jakarta. I think after his graduated from high school, and has an ambition to lead Indonesia after Sukarno. Then he went, I think at that time, he knows that the only way to be a president of Indonesia was by entering the military. So he went to the military academy in the same year as SBY. But one thing happens. He didn't graduate at the same time as SBY. He was, what is that, tidak naik kelas? What is that in
Repeat a grade.
yeah, remained the grade. So he was supposed to graduate in 1973. So then he was punished because he was deemed a desertion. He committed the act of desertion from the military. He was absent from the military academy for a couple of weeks.
AWOL. Yeah.
AWOL, that's correct. AWOL from the military for 2 weeks, I guess. Yeah, some people would call it 3 weeks, some people call it 2 weeks. But that's an AWOL. It's a very, very serious offense. And never ever in Indonesian military history that one guy who did an AWOL then just postponed his graduation. It's getting punished by postponing his graduation. It's usually you are going AWOL and you're out. That's the rule. I think it's everywhere in the world. It's like that, but not with Prabowo. So it's very lucky. And then he graduated in 1974. And then not long after that, after he was captain, he married to Suharto's daughter, Titik Prabowo, who was, according to some people, he's not really, this is a purely political marriage. They are not really, they have one son, of course, after that. But then his military career, I think, is in the fast track. Yeah, because of this, he come from a very, very privileged background. He married to a very, very powerful man the most powerful man in the country. So then he becomes, he does whatever he wants. So I think this is a lot of things in my interview with the military officers at that time. All of them, all of his superior complained that Prabowo was uncontrollable. Nobody can command him. He will create his own command. He become the commander of a battalion. He will provide you with everything. He will provide his troop with everything. So, new guns from abroad, the latest version of a gun, something like that. That no other unit has it, but he has it. And he also offered, I think at that time, one journalist who embedded during the Aceh operation interviewed one of the former subordinates of Prabowo, who really loves Prabowo. And this guy said that, well, with Prabowo, everything is about loyalty and money. If you can kill one leader of GAM, for example, cut his head, bring it to Jakarta, and I will give you 100 million rupiah. Yeah, that kind of thing. So people in the military, some people in the military really like this idea because really like him because he rewarded. Yeah, he rewarded all of these bad actions. He doesn't care about the human rights. And then Prabowo is a kind of stubborn man. He's not a man of principle, but he's just very, very, very stubborn, very, very ambitious. I think since very young, he was dreaming to become Indonesian president. He ran 4 times, once as a vice president, 3 times as a president and failed. Yeah, only the 4th, he was successful, but not really successful in the clear sense. But it's just because he made a deal with Jokowi that makes him as an incumbent, running as an incumbent under Jokowi's wings. So then he's thriving. He got 58% of the vote. But after 18 months of his administrations, all Indonesians become very uneasy. I think there's a lot of remorse buyers right now because never ever rupiah in these bad shapes. Indonesian stock market just go back to the new order times. Yeah. It's in the 500 level. Is a very very low. Economy is a very bad shapes, and we have no money. And what's this about Prabowo? I think the story about the soldier in Aceh, I think telling us all right now that thing with Prabowo, everything is about spend. Yeah, and then acquire. You took over to consolidate your power. That's all about Prabowo that I know so far.
Yeah, he is an interesting figure for sure, or that might be an understatement, right? Highly divisive and polarizing at one point, and now there's a massive disappointment with this guy, with this incumbent president, even among his voters, I think. But let me just add some other observations about Prabowo, and Made had made a very great outline about his life and his trajectory and his career. Again, this is a very ambitious figure, and he's also a third culture kid, a wealthy Indonesian diaspora who grew up abroad, really, and dream of serving his country by becoming the president, right? And as Made said, he'd been dreaming about this for a long time. I think one of the, if not the major source of disappointments with him is his haphazard policies on so many things, ranging from the economy to the free school lunch programs, which has many problems in their implementations. I think Prabowo fancies himself as a person who can offer an alternative vision, but that certainly is not the case. If we look at Prabowo comparatively in terms of his rhetoric and governing style as well as policies, he resembles so many right-wing or authoritarian populist leaders in power who promise a retool, right, a reset of the politics of their countries, only to further entrench the oligarchic, the elite interests, to the point where even the oligarchs or the elite supporting him became wary of his next steps. So that's the situation, the conundrum that Prabowo is at right now. I think one of the important things that, let's say, catapulted him to popularity, to power, first is, as Madi mentioned, the Jokowi effect, right? That he made a deal with Jokowi endorsed him, Prabowo team up with Gibran, Jokowi's son, as his VP candidate, and then they ran together in elections, and that was a popular ticket among the electorates, right? But like many other populists aspiring to govern, right, to win elections or in power, like Duterte, for example, or Marcos Jr., both in the Philippines, he managed to refashion himself, right, from this general with bad human rights records and reputation into this cuddly grandpa, right?
Yes.
That turns out to make a massive appeal to the electorates, including to younger electorates who have limited memories of the hardships and the atrocities under the New Order regime. And that was one of his main campaign strategies. And over time, I should also mention, and this is something that Made also alludes in his explanation, he managed to build a team of loyal followers in his circle. This obviously includes his elder brother, younger brother Hashim, but also other staffs, experts, and political operators. Let's say, who is behind, his party, his campaign activities, and also in a way, some of these people serve as, his, let's say, sparring partners in discussing ideas and whatnot. So he has this team behind him, that loyal followers that also helps him to survive in politics so far.
Just to add also that, while Obama is a Facebook president, Prabowo's election occurred in the environment of social media, especially TikTok, Instagram, and then fake news, misinformation, disinformation, trolling agents, where you can pay them. So he while Prabowo absolved himself under the wing of Jokowi that we have listened today, it was also the social media environment that actually was able to complete his reinvention of himself from this from this military abuse, from somebody who had committed past military abuse, to somebody who is gemoy, this, like Iqra mentioned, cute, grandfatherly, and approachable. So if you approach young people, the Gen Z, I have a lot of my cousins, for example, the Gen Z generation, they weren't aware of his past history, because of the inundation of this image of him as a gemoy, very cute and grandfatherly and approachable, and not of any mistake at all. So this rebranding actually normalized a figure that was obviously associated to military and new order violence before.
Anna, I want to follow up on that point you just made and ask just sort of like, how was that rebranding possible? What sort of ideological landscape do we see in post-New Order contemporary Indonesia? What does the media landscape look like? The education system? How is it possible that this kind of history that's really rather recent can be rewritten so thoroughly, or at least obscured so profoundly?
Right. So in terms of media landscape, then Indonesia's contemporary media systems, it actually still bears the imprint of the New Order. Under Suharto, media was centralized. It's concentrated in Jakarta and Java, and was actually designed to support developmentalism, national integration, and political stability. We all grew up under Suharto, so we all knew that there was only one channel, which is TVRI, Televisi Republik Indonesia, which is the state broadcasting monopoly. All other, television, radio, we have RRI, also the one channel, and film and the press, all of them operated under closed state supervision, right? And then liberalization occurred in late 1980s. This is the, neoliberalization of the economy that affected also the media. There's an open sky policies that allowed satellite television and foreign programming. Private television stations emerged, and then many of them were actually owned by Suharto's family and allies. And commercialization actually also gradually weakened this direct state control. Ironically, this media liberalization helped create the conditions for reformasi. We started to see alternative news sources. I actually have read thousands of pages of activists, communicating and building solidarity through the early internet in the 1990s. It's very interesting. And then, so it's kind of similar to, I think, the movement in Seattle, right, in the early 1990s, also through the internet, but also through emails. So in a sense, media liberalization contributed to the growth of civil society and opposition. Now, what happened after 1998? Well, after 1998, media became freer, but also more oligarchic. television remained dominant. We have the print decline while online media expanded. We're seeing large conglomerates. So this is a conglomeration process, such as MNC, Kompas, Gramedia, Jawa Pos, and Mahaka. They all came to dominate the multiple platforms. Actually, we are also seeing media owners increasingly became political actors themselves. Like Haritanu Sudibyo, who owns MNC, he also founded the party Perindo. So Indonesia moved from state-controlled media to oligarchic media. Then the digital revolution also changed the landscape. It did not necessarily decentralize power, though. So social media has become central to political mobilization, although we're seeing infrastructure remains concentrated in Java and urban centers. Google, Facebook, and other global platforms now capture much of Indonesia's digital advertising market. Actually, Indonesia is one of the largest consumers for social media. And so what we're seeing is that Indonesia's media system is shaped both by domestic oligarchs and global technology companies. So in terms of ideological order, post-New Order Indonesia is much more open than Suharto's Indonesia, but it is not ideologically neutral, right? So anti-communism remained deeply embedded. Pancasila remains the official state ideology. And then nationalism, religion, and development, they dominate public discourse. And then one of the most important changes after 1998, and I want to make sure that I mention this because this relates to our previous conversation, is the growing visibility of Islam in public life. So while we have political Islam in terms of politics, in terms of culture, we're seeing Islamic organizations, schools, television, fashion, and popular culture expanded. Then, if you come to Indonesia and watch TV in the early 1990s, there is nobody who wear hijab. But if you go to Indonesia after 2000s to today, you're seeing this middle-class, consumer-oriented Islamic lifestyles that's normalized through television and popular media. So that's what you're seeing. And then political Islam, of course, also still become the language through which social grievances are expressed. I actually did research in the past also around this newspaper, magazines is very into Ummah, very anti-Indonesia, a state of Indonesia called Sabili. So that actually could coexist as well. So the landscape of media is freer, where you can see this like outwardly political Islam, anti-state, anti-Pancasila existing, while also we have the more consumer culture, cute, hijabi, Islamic piety, and Islamic ethics, You also asked about education. In universities become more open, student activism return, like remember we talked about NKK, BKK a lot, which actually depoliticize universities, but it all has returned. And alternative histories of 65 have become more accessible, although at the same time, anti-communist narratives remain influential. So school textbooks still reproduce New Order understandings of 65. And like I said, Pancasila education remains important.
I'm Astrid Taylor, and you're listening to The Dig with Daniel Denvir, a podcast for people who want to deeply understand the world and organize to change it. That's why you should support the show at patreon.com/thedig.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Pluto Press, the independent radical publisher. A new book of Pluto's you might like is Money in the Mountains, The Cultural Trauma of Appalachia by Rianne Davis, an antidote to J.D. Vance's notorious hillbilly elegy. Money in the Mountains is an account of how Appalachia's misery is actually caused by generations of colonial exploitation, with all regional value extracted by a distant elite. Embedded as a therapist within the community, Rianne Davis pens a searing exploration of generational adversity and an indictment of the psychological abuse of the American dream. Dig listeners can get 50% off their first order of this or any book from Pluto Press using the code DIG50, that's DIG50, at plutobooks.com. Speaking of oligarchy, which came up a few times in your answer there, Anna, Benedict Anderson wrote in 2008, quote, "Deliberately or not, Suharto created over time the Indonesian national oligarchy of today. Quarrelsome, but intermarried. Competitive, but avoiding any serious internal conflict. Without ideas, but determined to hang on to what they have at all costs. This is the main reason why Suharto remained above the law after his fall, and why his children, except for the murderer Tommy, continue to control many of the country's television stations, tollways, and other strategic assets. The crucial thing is that this national oligarchy and its hangers-on are largely incapable of thinking outside the old regime's box. Cynics joke that there used to be one big Suharto. Now, there are hundreds of little ones." Just zooming back, I mean, we've answered this question in various ways already, but to answer it just all at once, why has Indonesian democracy taken on this form that it has of organized power blocks competing not so much on policy or ideology, but just the division of power and the spoils that they've looted from the people of Indonesia? Much like the Philippines, the political class is venal, dynastic, mediocre, corrupt, violent, narcissistic, clientelist, and, critically, cartelized rather than competitive in any substantive sense of that word. Were there ever real avenues for democracy in the post-New Order party system, or was the continuation of the sort of corporatist system solidified under the New Order? Was that kind of inevitable?
This is a tough question. The country is so big, and then it is impossible to govern. So if you don't have a centralized power that all of the people in the region look up to Jakarta and want Jakarta to be the center. I've been floating around the idea, trying to come up with a sort of federalism or even the breakup of Indonesia, like my example of East Kalimantan, who was in the 60s, has everything. It has forests, it has oil and gas, and now it has coal. This is the biggest, one of the biggest contributors. The region is the biggest contributor to Indonesian budget. But what did it get? Nothing. Had East Kalimantan become a state of its own, I think it will become more richer than Brunei Darussalam. I float that idea, and nobody listens. And I float the idea on Bali, for example. Can Bali, like Singapore, rely on its own people, its culture, its innovation, its culture, and it's built its own economy? Can it? My answer is yes, it can. Without Jakarta, you will thrive, but nobody buy that idea. So I think that's reverse. I'm a student of Ben Anderson, so I would say that it's a reverse of nationalism. The bad side of you have an imagined communities. This is a reverse of imagined communities. You have to hold on something psychologically. You have to hold on Jakarta. So everybody create the little Suharto in their region in order to look up to Jakarta and go to Jakarta and become powerful over there. Look at South Sulawesi, for example. There's a lot of strong men over there, strong dynasty, strong family, the Kala dynasty, the Amran Sulaiman dynasty, and everything. A friend of mine from Seoul has written extensively about these kind of things. And then they didn't focus on their region, but they look up to Jakarta. They go to Jakarta in order to dominate, to become a player in there, not for their own region. This is a kind of for me, it's a kind of probably a strange thing. But then we create an institution that make sacred of this state, this form of state, which give power to probably only 5 to 10,000 very powerful men in Jakarta who control everything, resources and whatever. And you equip them with 5 million, almost 5 million civil servant, almost next to be 1 million military, 600,000 police, and then countless tax officers, excise officer, and everything. So that's what you get with this kind of a structure. I think Indonesia. I just listened to Lee Kuan Yew's speech about Indonesia near the collapse of the Suharto regime. And he said Indonesia will never become industrial countries as long as you have this kind of structure. This structure that will hinder you to innovate because you are blessed. Indonesia is blessed with natural resources. So I think you need something to hold on. And everybody in the region, I think, just look up to Jakarta and try to become a player for there.
I think my assessment echoes what Anderson said, and in a way partially disagree with him. Sorry, Blimade. I think the New Order, in its early years, they tried to come up with something quite sophisticated in terms of ideas and ideological platform, because they had to face the communists and Sukarno, right? Sukarno is populism, right? So the early years of the New Order, this anti-communist coalition was concerned with coming up with an alternative vis-a-vis this anti-colonial and populist socialism. And one of the prerequisites, indeed, for New Order's long rule of power, and this is something that early New Orderists, early thinkers and activists behind the New Order wrote in their many essays and articles and writings, one of the prerequisites is indeed to have a tame, masses, citizenry, and middle class, right, who are able to participate but don't question a lot with the overall political economic system that is in place, right? So this is it was a path-dependent situation, and that is why we are in the situation that we are today. So that's why the oligarchic system is still intact. And in many ways, we lack a historical consciousness of what had happened and what could be different in the future. We lack the imagination to, as Made said as well, to imagine different futures, a more progressive, equitable future for the country. But just to be more specific about the differences, right, between Indonesia and the Philippines, for example, in terms of the way the oligarchies in these two countries operate, right? So the Dutch, for example, they left neither a strong industrial base, neither strong commercially oriented capitalist class, or plantation estates, right? And political representation was limited. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, the Spaniards left latifundia and a highly unequal agrarian structure, and the Americans introduced electoral democracy in such unequal political economic conditions, right? So as a result, we have different types of oligarchic structure, let's say, between the two countries. To use the typology of another student of Ben Anderson, other than Blimade, John Seidel, in the Philippines, you have bossism, right, and local despotism, right? Meanwhile, you don't really see the same level of elite capture at the local level in Indonesian political economy. But I also agree that there are similarities between the two countries in terms of oligarchic dominance in politics, the high level of elite cartelization, the corrupt, narcissistic, dynastic, and mediocre character of the ruling elites that you point out then. That is why, when observers praise the quality of Indonesian democracy vis-a-vis the one that our neighbors have in the Philippines, a while ago, right? Like this was popular, like this assessment for a while. Or when civil society and social movement activists feel that we're not as bad as our neighbors in the Philippines, I've always been skeptical of such assessment. That is why, for example, when Duterte came to power, I thought the correct question was not why Indonesia managed to evade such trend of authoritarian populism, but rather when will Indonesia follow that pattern? And indeed, we did follow that pattern eventually with the victory presidency of Prabowo Subianto.
I want to turn to the economy. First, as we've discussed, Suharto inaugurated an era of just profound intensification at a massive scale of extraction of Indonesian natural resources, the looting of Indonesia's forests, mines, fisheries. Why has the return to democracy only intensified this model of mass-scale extractive plunder?
Yeah, because there's no alternative. Democracy, I think, is Indonesia really doing a democratic things? Is it what we practice in Indonesia right now? Is a democracy at all? Of course, we have a political party, but all the political party are dominated by all of this powerful Jakarta guy. Yeah, there's no local political party who's allowed in Indonesia, and they make a habit. I think that doing election makes the democracy work very, very costly. It's a very, very expensive to run democracy. It's not supposed to that way. If you have a real democracy, you have to start from bottom up. You have to give power to the region so the region can control it. But this is Indonesia who always obsessed with unity. It's a kind of obsession. The Indonesian elites always cultivate a fear of division within the countries. And then the fear and division, and it makes us obsessed about unity. The only thing that can stabilize the system was the elites, those who are in power. So you see that there's no turnover in Indonesian business elites, for example, between the New Order and the post-New Order. Right now, I think the people who are very rich during the New Order still very rich now. The second generations of these people, Lim Siu Leong, you have Anthony Salim. William Suryajaya, you have Edward Suryajaya, for example. Yeah, not so many changes in terms of the economic structure. Yeah, because of the institutional design of this country that makes introduction to democracy become very, very costly, and the people couldn't afford it. No ordinary, even politicians. For example, just like Jokowi, we have a hope in him before. Not from elite class, but soon after he entered the race, he has to deal with all of this oligarch. He needs money to run. And when he is in power, he abused state budget, state fund, distributed it as a welfare. So a huge welfare being distributed. A lot of this is actually buying vote. If you couldn't afford to buy vote, forget it. You couldn't run in this system. So that's also explained. There's no other alternative. The cheapest and the easiest way to get money is by plundering natural resources. There's no incentive to innovate. There's no incentive to educate people, to invest in education, for example. It's too long. Yeah. If you're a politician, you don't want to go to that way. You need the quick cash. And quick cash means natural resources. You plant palm oil now, and then by the next election, you can harvest it 5 years. That's how lucrative this business is, and it's will going on and on. Yeah, and no politicians care about the electrifying, green energy, for example. It takes too long. It's well in rhetoric they're doing it, but in practice, no. And why on earth, for example, Prabowo has the stunting babies in Indonesia. 19% of Indonesian babies children are stunting under 5 years old, are stunting, malnutrition. So and then he created a program called free meal. Yeah. And then free meal, he feed 82 in his plan, 82 million children, every child, even if you don't need it. Yeah, because of what? Because this is money. That's how they distribute the money. Is this a democracy? Of course, this is election. It's not democracy. This is an election. And the election is very costly because the elites want it's very costly. I think that's my answer.
Finally, one more on the economy. Prabowo has followed his predecessors, and this has received a lot of attention from scholars and business press from all over the world, for pursuing an industrial policy that's meant to move Indonesia up the value chain, a shift from just extracting raw materials like nickel to manufacturing higher value added products for which nickel is a key ingredient, like batteries. How is this strategy faring, and where does it come from, intellectually speaking, the policy framework, both globally and domestically? And lastly, is it working in the sense of, is it laying the groundwork for any sort of more equitable development model, or is it just intensifying the extraction that we've been discussing, all while enriching favored domestic oligarchs at the expense of transnationals and disfavored domestic oligarchs?
Yeah, I think there is an illusion for a while among liberal reformers, as well as sadly activists, social movement folks, that Indonesian democracy and democratic reforms will bring a significant degree of at least redistribution, right, or reformist or social democratic agenda for the general population. That has not been the case, except in several limited policy areas, right? If anything, and this has been well documented in critical scholarship as well as in many stories in media, reports by NGOs, and just on the ground situation reported by ordinary citizens, that has not been the case. That if anything, these very institutions of bourgeois democracy, which has given us some space to organize and participate politically, the very same institutions actually facilitate this continuing extraction, plundering under different guises, whether it's for the infrastructures, whether it's to attract foreign investments, whether it's to join the latest hype in nickel mining and processing and what have you. So intellectually, I think we can debate the origins of where, for example, Prabowo got these ideas. I've heard a number of speculations about this. Maybe that might be inspired by Sumitro, his father, and other economists inspired by Sumitro. But for sure, this mode of plundering is not new. As we've discussed pretty extensively, this has been around. This mode of extraction, this extractivism has been around since the New Order period, and it doesn't change really. So it just gets transformed into different modes and types of extractivism, right? Adding more or new features here and there, right? So unless there is a crisis, then maybe there is no structural forcing the necessary reforms to happen. Even then, even if such crisis happens, this requires the leadership, right, of progressive forces, the political power of the working people, which sadly we don't really have right now. The working people, popular social movements still lack the leadership to promote such reforms, if not radical reforms, right? What the policies that Prabowo has been promoting so far, whether it's the free school lunch program or nickel processing, that has become a source of rent seeking among the oligarchs and cronies. So I'm very skeptical that this will bring something different. This will not lead, I think, to a more equitable development mode or outcome, and the numbers have been pretty clear on that. I want to mention, one thing that actually has been promoted by red unions in Indonesia and progressive organizations, right? The need for industrialization to build our industrial base, productive base, and to support workers, working in such sectors, right? And by industrial base, we can think of it, not only in traditional sense, right, but also in a broader sense, right, including in newer forms of industry like gig economy and whatnot. That campaign, I think we have to give credit to red unions and progressive organizations that has been promoting, has been campaigning for the need for a national industrial strategy. This campaign, sadly, has not been popular. I mean, this is something that has been promoted by several unions with actual mass base, but sadly, and this has not been popular. But I think it is a message that should be promoted again. And again, this is another example of, despite the weakness, the organizational and political weakness of the left in Indonesia, we still got some pretty good ideas that can resonate with the general public.
It seems to me that a lot of the FDI and these new projects in Indonesia is coming from China, and I wonder how the increasing role of Chinese. No, not so. It's
No.
U.S. FDI.
No, it's the largest, I think, coming from Singapore, and the second is Japan still, and Korea, and the number four is China.
Yeah, that has been. I wrote an article about this in Monthly Review, actually. So sorry, shameless self-promotion. But this has been dubbed as what mainstream IR literature called as hedging strategy, right? Indonesia navigating itself in multipolar world among big powers. That's a pretty fair assessment. The problem is this hedging is done in the interest of the elites, right? So this is not some kind of strategic multipolarity in solidarity, with the Palestinians, for example, or with the broader global South, not to mention with the working people of Indonesia. I think there is realization, broadly speaking, among activists and also among scholars looking at this, that it's a good idea to diversify Indonesia's FDI and have diverse set of foreign partners and obviously trade well with China and welcome Chinese investment. The problem is obviously the impacts of Chinese investment on the ground, right? The human, the environmental and labor impacts of this, Chinese investment in nickel mining sector, for example, which affected not only local population but also Chinese workers actually working in these sectors. So this is something that the government obviously has to look closer, pay more attention to it, and do something about it. And obviously, there's been a lot of campaign and report by unions and civil society folks on the need to look at the environmental and social impacts and costs of these investments by Chinese firms.
I think the number one FDI in Indonesia is coming from Singapore. The second one is coming from Hong Kong. And then after that, China. And then after that, Japan. Why Singapore and Hong Kong? This is very interesting. Because Singapore has a very low tax, and also Hong Kong, 7% tax. So if you are operating in Singapore, you create a holding over there, you transfer all of the wealth to Singapore, and they tax it to 7%. There's a flat rate 7% tax in Singapore. Whether you're poor or you're rich, you got 7%. In Indonesia, using progressive taxation. So then, all of the money going to Singapore and Hong Kong, and then come back to Indonesia as an FDI. That's how it works, actually. So it's not really about. It is about geopolitics and everything. I think it's too far. If you think like how the economy is worked, and then Prabowo keep complaining about this. We are plundered by foreign agents. This is because of the structure of Indonesian economy. And I think it's a very sensitive issue if you apply the 7% in Indonesia. Of course, all of the businesses will come to Indonesia, but then, even though Indonesia banned the term of socialism, we are in our thinking, we are socialists. So it's fair, unjust, and unfair if you give a very rich people 7%, but in fact they pay no tax at all because of this scheme that not so many people know about.
Prabowo seems currently to be stumbling from crisis to crisis, a program for universal free school meals that resulted in mass poisoning of children, constant economic crisis, and last year, massive youth anti-corruption, economic justice protests. Let's close with a big question for our listeners and for this series, and we'll bring Abi back for this question. Farabi Fakih, welcome back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where do you see things heading from here, and specifically for the left? Does last year's protest movement make you hopeful that popular movements and a proper political left can be rebuilt in Indonesia? And what sort of left does exist today in Indonesia, both on the level of political parties and then also on the level of popular sector organizations and movements?
So I think in question of what Prabowo is doing currently, it seems that he is trying to sort of resurrect the kind of military-based structures that were present during the New Order period. But, if the New Order was a tragedy, I think this one is a farce, actually. It'll really depend on to what extent the kinds of reforms that Prabowo has initiated, which has its roots in Jokowi's sort of nationalist, state-focused industrialization project, damages the economy, and whether it sort of damages the legitimacy of the current sort of oligarchy and the structure of the state. I think that actually has the potential to open up spaces for sort of dialogue and sort of for participation. One that we really haven't seen to such an extent after the reform period. But then again, if the kind of structure that Prabowo is trying to create, sort of this sort of clamping down on society, if it works out, then we are going to see a much more sort of centralized state similar to the one during the New Order. So, but we'll have to see what happens in the next couple of years. To what extent does these kind of reforms damage the legitimacy? But if it does sort of create an opening, I think there is a potential for a kind of revival of participatory politics of the left. And these, I would imagine, would stem from the kind of forces that we've seen developing since the last 20, 30 years in the context of, for instance, Adat or indigenous rights movements in Indonesia, which has developed since the 80s, the environmental movement, and then of course students as well. So the kind of leftism that really can emerge are those that are much more in tune with the current conditions. So a lot of sort of criticism since the last couple of years has really been focused much more on environmental issues, on criticism against extractions of. We had, for instance, a couple of months ago, the massive disaster in Aceh and in North Sumatra involving flooding resulting from logging issue and extraction of timber. And so the kind of expression has been much more in tune to the current sort of, the environmental issues. And so in that sense, the kind of the emergence of the left will be quite different from the ones that have occurred in the previous iteration, which is much more ideological. But this one would be much more in tune to the kinds of problems which are, based, yes, on a criticism of capitalism, but on the other hand also on much more direct issues such as the environment or justice, social justice, and so forth. Yeah.
Let me start with a clarification then, that for the listeners especially, that kiri or the left in Indonesia carries historical, political, ideological, and emotional associations with socialism, Marxism, and communism, but it does not simply mean the PKI. Nor does it correspond to the American usage of the left, which often here in the US, right, refers broadly to the Democratic Party. So it's left kiri is really Marxism, communism, socialism. Now, what survived from the genocide of 65 is memory and archives. These memories survive through former political prisoners, survivors, exiles, and families who kept stories alive despite decades of repression. And many archives were destroyed, actually, by the New Order. They were burned down, they were destroyed, basically. And many survived as well, though, in private collections, overseas archives, underground publications, and oral histories. There have been recent effort to conduct oral histories, especially by the Institute Sejarah Sosial Indonesia, or the Indonesian Institute of Social History, ISSI. Memory also survives in bodies, in trauma, in scars, in the lives of surviving prisoners and their families, and in the mass graves that remain scattered across Indonesia. And these memories and archives have become essential for the reconstruction of the Indonesian left. And through these memories, archives, and oral histories, the Indonesian left has had to be rebuilt largely from scratch, right? And as our discussion over several episodes have shown, the New Order subjected the left systematically and over long-term process of repression that unfolded. And I'm going to give you the very, the pattern in here. There are 3 stages in which the left has been repressed. One is through the destruction, mass killings, imprisonment, disappearance, and public spectacles of violence. Second, through consolidation, which is through continued intimidation through the military, police, paramilitary groups, alongside all of those anti-communist propaganda through schools, media, films, etc. And then most importantly is through co-optation, which, some former leftists, they renounced their earlier commitment, while later generations of activists, like the 98 activists, they were often absorbed into the state, as well as NGOs and parties. So the result is that the contemporary Indonesian left, they lack the organizational continuity that existed between earlier generations, right? The PKI of the 50s, for example, was partially rebuilt by activists who had participated in the movements of the 20s. That intergenerational transmission was largely destroyed after 65. And so they had to rebuild from scratch. And the most important attempt after 65, attempt to rebuild the left was the PRD, which is the People's Democratic Party that was established in 1996. And the activists emerged from student movements, labor organizing, and underground discussion groups. They held informal study circles and clandestine organizing, and to then make them a much broader movement. And what's really interesting, the regime though, even though this started from scratch, the regime quickly portrayed the PRD as a new PKI. So following the July 27, 1996 attack on Megawati's PDI headquarters, the government blamed the PRD, for example. And many of its leaders were arrested and imprisoned, and Budiman Sujatmiko became its best-known figure. Fast forward to today, Budiman Sujatmiko became a part of Prabowo's cabinet. But anyway, so the PRD played an important role in reformasi, yet they struggled electorally, right? So what I want to say is that PRD represented the first serious attempt to rebuild the Indonesian left after 1965. But it operated in a completely different political environment. No mass peasant movement, relatively weak labor organizations, persistent anti-communism, oligarchic democracy, right? It did not have electoral success, but historically it's important because it reintroduced socialist politics into Indonesian public life. And maybe Iqra can mention this, but PRD later, after 98, fragmented into multiple organizations. One of the important intellectual development is actually the creation of new institutions of leftist thoughts. Kun Hussein Ponto, who was a former PRD member, he established with a couple of his colleagues Indo Progress in 2006, which has become perhaps the most important Marxist and socialist intellectual forum in contemporary Indonesia. And many of us here, Iqra, Made, and I are part of this collective. And then what sort of left exists today? Indonesia has a left today, but not a mass left comparable to what existed before 65. What we have is this fragile and fragmented constellation of labor activism, student radicalism, feminist organizing, environmental movement, etc., right? So to your question, does last year's protest movement make me hopeful? Yes and no. Yes, because the protests of the past few years show that younger Indonesians remain capable of collective action and moral outrage. We've had reformasi di korupsi, reformation is being corrupted, the protest against omnibus law, the ojol protest, and now as we speak, there is actually a protest too then called, it's a Menuju Indonesia Bangkrut, toward Indonesia's bankruptcy demonstration. So the desire for justice and democracy is clearly there, but also no, I'm not hopeful because one of our major problems today is the weakness of political organization. Under the new order, parties became vehicles for elite bargaining. After reformasi, many activists, understandably, they turned toward NGOs, communities, and informal networks. So organizing today often favors the rhizome, the decentralized, horizontal, leaderless movements. And as some colleagues in Indo Progress recently argued, leaderless movements can mobilize effectively, but they often struggle to accumulate power. They react rather than build. So my fear is that we continue experiencing these cycles of protest without changing the political economic structures that produce the grievances themselves. So what is the step? Well, I only have the first step. which is that I think Indonesians must confront both the past and the present with radical honesty. If we look at the political elites, the picture is not encouraging. Oligarchs remain powerful, the military remains influential, anti-communism remain deeply embedded, the party system remains dominated by money, patronage, and dynasties. So you're right, in some ways, Ben Anderson was right. There used to be one big Suharto, and now there are many smaller ones. But Indonesian history, and we've talked about this since the beginning of this series, Indonesian history teaches us that political orders that seem permanent often turn out to be fragile. Colonialism, 350 years, seem permanent. New orders seem permanent. Even anti-communism once seemed permanent. Yet all of these systems eventually develop contradictions that they could not manage, right? And the central contradiction today, I think, lies between an increasingly unequal and precarious society and a highly oligarchic political economy that's protected by the military and the state. So the question is whether the grievances become political, because, grievances alone do not produce political movements, but organization is fundamental in movement building. The left before 65, they spent decades, building unions, schools, newspapers, cooperatives, women's organizations, political education. It built institutions before it became a mass movement. Today, we often have mobilization without organization, right? Protests without institutions. So if the left does not organize social grievances, we learn already too that other political languages will. Islam, political Islam, nationalism, populism have repeatedly occupied that space. So I also do not think the answer is simply reviving communism as it existed before 65. In the current anti-communist climate, bringing back old symbols or labels is unlikely to work, right? If not outright dangerous, actually, in the case of Indonesia, as we have learned. So the task actually, in my view, is to recover the democratic, egalitarian, and emancipatory substance of those traditions. So in my view, we are confronted with these underlying questions of who controls the economy, who benefits from development, who owns the land, the mines, the media, the platform, and how democracy can extend beyond elections into the economy itself. These are all socialist questions, even when people do not call it socialist, right? And also in the case of Indonesia, I also think the left must learn from its own history. The Indonesian left was extraordinarily successful in organizing society, but it never solved the question of the military and eventually became comfortable with increasingly undemocratic political arrangements under the guided democracy. Where do things head from here? I don't know. But I do know that the future will not be decided simply by elections or elite competition. It will depend on whether all of us, workers, students, farmers, women, environmental activists, teachers, whether we all can build organizations that are capable of acting collectively over the long term and eventually taking power to create a Nusantara that truly belongs to its people and to all more than human living beings that inhabit and share it. The Indonesian left, I don't think, it was not simply destroyed in 65. It was interrupted. Now, whether it can be rebuilt and in what forms remains one of the great unanswered questions of Indonesian history.
Yeah, I'm hopeful. I have to admit that I'm as I back to Indonesia since 5 years ago. I'm pretty much involved in all of these kind of movements, organizing and everything. Of course, not directly, but indirectly, a lot of interacting with so many actors at the civil society level, also organizing with so many young people, which inspire me a lot. I'm hopeful, actually, not hopeful for a grand big parties like Indonesian Communist Party. But I'm hopeful for the centralized movements who are inspired by the idea of the left the justice, the struggle for class movement, and building something out of very local. People call it rhizome, and some, but I think Anna has described it very aptly. This is, yeah, it's very good at reacting to something, but not to coordinating something. But also, I think young people start questioning this state, the design of this state, the architecture of this state. Is this really fit for us? Is this will benefit all of the people? This will bring our voice being heard by the elites. Why not building something smaller than that? Why not creating something at the district level, for example? Yeah, people in Pati, one of the district in the Central Java province, organized. And even until now, I think it started by a small movement. I think they learned from a protest in Kendeng, a community that are going to be affected to build a cement factory over there, and the society protested, and then the people look at that, and then I think a lot of activists, civil society activists going over there started organizing, and then the movement is accidentally building bigger and bigger and bigger and become I think last year I think this year they were able to mobilize around 100,000 people and topple the region in the district. But I think that it needs to take a step further by trying to control, trying to get to the power, bring it to the people, bring it closer to the people. This is I think I'm hopeful for. I even imagine, for example, give us a very poor region in the island of Flores, for example. Very poor, backward, very low human development index. And with the idea of socialism, turn it into something really meaningful. The people can participate and people can make progress together. That's what I really hope for. And a lot of young people has this kind of imagination. And don't also forget about the impact of the documentary, the new documentary Pesta Babi, Pig Feast. People might say that, well, this is only talk about Papua, but young people right now increasingly talking about colonialism. What I think I never imagined before in my life that Indonesian youth will talk about colonialism done by their own country to and change the perception of Papua entirely. They are not part of Indonesia. People start questioning that, and then people start to agree that they are not part of Indonesia because we treated them differently from ours, and they are not ours either. So, what is our right over there? Why do we put very big military forces over there, for example? Yeah. This is starting from a very, very small communities, very, very small collectives. And I think I'm hopeful. The other thing, you also see that all of the old structures through the youth organization, HMI, PMII, PMKRI, GMNI, etc. All of these youth organizations, starting from Indonesian campuses, also organized. But this is the backbone of the regime, the old regime. I think this is the counterbalance of this small movement. And these people will become the servant of the oligarch, this organization. They are mobilizing, and on the other hand, the leftists with this kind of form also mobilize. And I'm still thinking right now, this is beneficial for the future? I think yes. Should we have the centralized power? We build something bigger so we can do something at the national level. I'm not so sure about that, because we right now, let's not direct our attention to the national level. Because of what? Because it's very easy being captured by the elites. So I think we just need to, let it spread, yeah, everywhere, and let it. If you want to be independent, South, North, West Sumatra, why not? Yeah, organize yourself, organize your own community, be independent from the state, and then don't feed the state, because the state eat up you, eat all of you. Yeah, eat all of your belonging through taxation and everything. Don't make them fat. Give it to your own community. That's my idea of left in the future in Indonesia. Whether it will be successful, I don't know. But I'm working on that with so many young people, with inspiring me, and I think hopefully it works in the future. I don't know.
Yeah, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, right? As Gramsci said, it might sound cliche and trite, but I think it's true. Despite everything, despite all the defeats, all the infightings, all the weaknesses, I think we do have to recognize the achievements and the past legacies and the possibilities that all of that would not be possible without the left in Indonesia in its various forms, right?
Yeah.
Without the
100%.
communists of the
Yes.
past, without all the popular social movements during and after the New Order, without all sorts of leftist experimentations in political organizations, in political education, including Progress, Islam Bergerak, and all these popular education websites spreading Marxist and socialist ideas and political thinking to the masses, right? And what have happened in the past couple of years, I think, shows that, right? Despite all the activist infighting, which I'm also guilty of getting involved sometimes, I have to admit, class struggle continues, right? Class struggle continues, and the masses keep going, and I think as radicals, as socialists, that's eye-opening to me. We shouldn't lose hope because the masses keep going. I think one should believe in the masses for sure, and I don't always agree with Zizek, especially his last rounds of politics, but I think he's right when he said miracles happen in politics, all right? And just adding to what Anna and Mada mentioned about, the long list of achievements that left, broadly speaking, have made in Indonesia, right? Let me just add a couple of more things, right? So, as I mentioned in our previous conversation, there are labor and peasant unions working in different sectors. Also, among the urban poor, there are unions. Let me just shout out several comrades and organizations here, such as the Indonesian People's Struggle Union, SPRI, and the Urban Poor Network, for example, JRM cooperating in Jakarta and some other cities. There are also other progressive unions for university lecturers, journalists, so-called creative workers, such as writers, artists, NGO staffs, and designers. This happened even under the massive situation of de-industrialization, right? Even under the situation of massive precariousness, right? The left as political force remains weak, unfortunately, but we manage to mainstream, as we've discussed, leftist or socialist-leaning ideas, right, and to the masses. And I think even within the liberal sections of civil society, or even among the apolitical middle class, quote unquote, you can see a sense of social justice, a sense of class conflict that has seeped in as well, right? But indeed, it is what we're lacking now. It's political organization and political leadership. Let me also mention that to date, there have been multiple attempts to revive the left organizationally, although most failed. But even most recently, there have been a number of attempts, right, to revive the left through political parties or even through conversation among progressive unions, right? So I think this is the right steps in the right directions. Obviously, there would be disagreements, there would be debates, but I think we're all united in the commitment for a democratic class struggle.
Yes.
And I think moving forward, again, I also don't know what the future left would look like, but I think there are a number of points that future leftist forces have to take into account, right? And this is something that leftist organizers, activist scholars have to start think about long and hard, starting now. These are the hard questions of, for example, how to manage the economy, how to make a broad appeal beyond our typical activist core, for example, how to handle oppression and repression by the state's armed forces and police force, for example, how to organize communities so that we can do community self-policing, for example. If we look at a number of protests, mass arrests happen, and typically it's the most precarious activists that got captured. So these are some of the hard questions that we have to think long and hard. And I guess just looking at the enthusiasm, right, the frustration and also enthusiasm of the broader public, of new generation of workers, and also many young people, as Made mentioned, right? I also work quite a bit with them. I kept meeting a new generation of activists, younger scholars, and that indeed made me hopeful that something, will happen in the future. I think our task today is to prepare ourselves politically, intellectually, and organizationally, so when the opportunity arises, we'll be ready to seize the moment and hopefully start working not only, for mobilization, but for eventually our political victories for the working people. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, Rianne Subijanto, Made Supriatma, Iqra Anugrah, and also Farabi Fakih, thank you all very, very much. What a wonderful series of discussions.
Thank you for producing this fantastic Nusantara series, Dan. It's been productive for my own work and my own thinking. And I'm grateful for to be in conversation with brilliant minds, Blimade, Iqra, Abi, and you too, Dan. It's been fun. Terima kasih banyak.
Me too. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me, Dan. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dan, Blimade, and Pohana for this. Yeah.
That was Rianne Subijanto, Made Supriatma, Iqra Anugrah, and Farabi Fakih for the final episode, episode 8 of Nusantara, a series on the history of Indonesia. Rianne Subijanto is a professor of communication studies at Baruch College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's the author of Communication Against Capital, Red Enlightenment at the Dawn of Indonesia, and a co-editor of The Indonesian Left in the 20th Century, Beyond the Rise and Fall of a Party. She also serves as an editor for the Indonesian left media, Indoprogress.com. Made Supriatma is a visiting research fellow at the Isaias Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. He specializes in Indonesian politics, civil-military relations, ethnic conflict, and state bureaucracy. Iqra Anugrah is a research fellow at the Department of Foreign Languages, Literatures, and Modern Cultures at the University of Turin. He also holds affiliate positions at the International Institute for Asian Studies at Leiden University and the Institute for Economic and Social Research, Education, and Information in Jakarta. An interdisciplinary political theorist, his current project investigates multi-strand conservatism in modern Indonesia, and Iqra maintains an active engagement in Indonesia's popular social movement scene. Farabi Fakih Fakih is the head of the master's program in the history department of Gajah Mada University in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. He's worked on the history of the decolonization of the Indonesian state and is currently working on a manuscript on the history of natural resource management, particularly oil and gas. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that, the question is, can mankind fulfill its destiny without a fundamental revolution in the social state of Asia? While other podcasts similarly interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks, little less often in the summer. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theorio Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also Instagram and Blue Sky at The Dig Radio. And please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this one. If it's on iTunes or Spotify, please rate and review us positively. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really does that is you telling other people you know, IRL or online or however, to check out the pod. Please make propaganda for us, and do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.